Today, Azerbaijan mourns the victims of Black January. 35 years ago, unarmed Azerbaijani people took to the streets to protest the Soviet regime. Heavily armed Soviet troops brutally suppressed them. This tragedy was shocking, but sadly not unprecedented. Black January was not an isolated event. Across the Soviet Union, people resisted oppression, often paying the ultimate price. The USSR had a long history of using violence against its citizens to maintain control. Today, we will explore these dark chapters. Countries that came under Soviet influence after World War II were destined to suffer under Stalinist oppression. Most of these states were members of the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance which was the Soviet response to the Western organization NATO. The Soviet Union viewed Eastern Europe as a buffer zone to shield itself from potential Western attacks. Some of them were not even a part of USSR and were known as satellite states. That meant the Soviets controlled their foreign policy. One of these satellite states was Hungary. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 erupted after Nikita Khrushchev's speech denouncing Stalin's rule, sparking protests for democracy and freedom from Soviet control. Students and workers led demonstrations, toppling Soviet statues and clashing with secret police. Soviet troops entered Budapest, killing 12 and wounding many. But their withdrawal marked an early victory for the revolutionaries. Imre Nagy replaced the Soviet-backed Ernő Gerő as prime minister, yet protesters continued demanding greater freedoms, including leaving the Warsaw Pact. Determined to maintain Soviet control, Khrushchev sent the Red Army back into Hungary to crush the uprising. On November 4th, Soviet forces launched a full-scale invasion of Budapest. Approximately 3,000 Hungarians were killed, 13,000 wounded, and 200,000 fled the country as refugees. Nagy was captured after attempting to escape to Yugoslavia and was later executed. The Soviet grip on Eastern Europe remained firmly in place.
The Red Army, which just a few...
In the early hours of August 21, 1968, Czechoslovak radio announced that 5 Warsaw Pact nations had invaded the country just before midnight. Around 200,000 troops and 5,000 tanks entered Czechoslovakia. In central Prague, unarmed civilians gathered at the Czechoslovak radio building to prevent its takeover by enemy forces. Again, the target was a republic which was not a part of Soviet Union, yet the Soviets, alarmed by the political liberalization movement in Czechoslovakia, which is called the Prague Spring. Leader of Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, sought to implement socialism with a human face, but the Soviets considered even this as a threat to the regime. In 1968, invasion of Czechoslovakia by Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces exhibited significant brutality to reassert control. In Prague, attempts to defend institutions like Radio Prague left about 20 dead before its capture. Overall, 137 civilians were killed and around 500 injured in the uneven fight. Reforms were crushed. Dubček was arrested and taken to Moscow, and the invasion's brutality prompted a mass exodus of Czechoslovakia's intellectual and business elite to the west. Soviet forces violently dispersed a pro-independence demonstration also in Georgia. April 9, 1989 events went down to the history as a Tbilisi tragedy. By 1988, Georgia's anti-Soviet movement had intensified, with tensions escalating after the Lichny Assembly, where thousands of Abkhaz demanded secession from Georgia. Georgian nationalists accused the Soviet government of exploiting separatism to suppress independence efforts. On April 4, 1989, tens of thousands gathered on Rustaveli Avenue in Tbilisi. Unable to manage the protests, local Soviet authorities requested military intervention, disarming Georgian police beforehand. Soviet troops, armed with batons and spades, attacked peaceful demonstrators, targeting individuals rather than dispersing the crowd. Emergency workers were blocked from assisting the injured, and ambulances were attacked. The crackdown left 21 dead and over 100 injured, marking one of the darkest chapters in Georgia's independence struggle. In 1988, mass pro-independence movements emerged in the Baltic republics. On the same year, when nearly 2 million people, by joining their hands, formed a human chain stretching 690 kilometers across Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, it became a bold statement for independence. Known as a Baltic Way, the peaceful protest emphasized not just political resistance to Soviet rule, but also the moral imperative for Baltic sovereignty. Soviet authorities responded with threats, but failed to suppress the growing momentum. In 1990, Lithuania became the first Soviet republic to declare independence, followed by Estonia and Latvia. Moscow deemed these declarations illegal, imposing an economic blockade and escalating tensions. Soviet troops occupied parts of Vilnius. The conflict escalated on January 13, 1991, during the Soviet assault on Vilnius TV tower. Thousands of unarmed Lithuanians gathered to protect the tower, standing against Soviet tanks and soldiers. Tanks rammed into demonstrators and soldiers opened fire on the crowd. The violence, now known as the Vilnius massacre, left 14 civilians dead and over 140 injured as they peacefully protested for freedom. Just a year earlier, a quite similar scenario happened in Baku streets, Azerbaijan. The roots of this tragedy trace back to the late 1980s, when the movement to annex Karabakh to Armenia gained momentum. Countless ethnic Azerbaijanis were forced from their ancestral lands with Soviet support. In response, hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis gathered at Baku's Freedom Square to protest Soviet rule and territorial demands. To crush the independence movement, the Soviet army launched a brutal crackdown. On the night of the 19th to the 20th January in 1990, 26,000 Soviet troops invaded Baku under direct orders from the USSR leadership. The assault left 147 civilians dead and 744 injured. Soviet tanks destroyed everything in their path, targeting cars, ambulances and civilians, including women and children. Despite the state of emergency and Soviet control, Azerbaijanis refused to retreat. Nearly 1 million people took to the streets to honor the victims in a solemn funeral procession. The martyrs were carried on mourners' shoulders to their final resting place in Martyrs' Lane. Here lie the brave souls who stood unarmed against tanks and guns, fighting for our rights to self-determination. Black January had a decisive impact on shaping the Azerbaijani national identity and marked a historic turning point in the restoration of independence. Brutal actions of the Red Army targeted Azerbaijanis who never thought a Soviet soldier would shoot at them. And it was the exact same for all the other cases. Across the former Soviet Union, from Baku to Budapest, from Vilnius to Tbilisi, freedom was not handed to us, it was wrested from the hands of oppression. It came at a heavy price, through bloodshed, unbearable shocks, and the breaking of countless spirits. But even in the darkest of times, the will of the people proved unshakable.